Three legends of horror cinema agreed to appear in the same film. A real studio funded it. A real distributor picked it up. And then it simply disappeared, so completely that most horror fans today have never even heard the title. That is not the strangest disappearance on tonight's list. It is the mildest one. Subscribe before we start. 7 horror films from the 1970s that had everything a hit needed. Real stars, real budgets, real distribution, and somehow vanished anyway. By the end of this list, you will understand why disappearing was never about quality. The Uncanny 1977. An author researching a book about the secret conspiracy of domestic cats controlling human civilization visits his publisher to present his findings. And the film unfolds as 3 separate anthology segments illustrating his increasingly disturbing evidence. Each story building the case that cats have been manipulating their owners toward violence for centuries while humanity remained completely unaware. Denny Heroux made The Uncanny as a Canadian-British co-production with Peter Cushing playing the author whose theory frames the anthology structure. Cushing's participation lending the production genuine horror credibility, even as the central premise, an entire species of household pets orchestrating human deaths, tested the boundaries of what audiences could take seriously, regardless of the cast's evident commitment. Ray Milland and Donald Pleasance appear in separate segments, giving the anthology format 3 distinct registers across its runtime, each story using its cat-based menace with varying degrees of formal seriousness that the overall production never quite reconciled into a consistent tone. The practical challenge of directing actual cats to perform threatening behavior on cue produced a production process considerably more complicated than the finished film's runtime suggests. Animal trainers working alongside the cast to coordinate sequences that required genuine patience given the fundamental unpredictability of the performers involved. The Inheritance segment, in which a woman's cats become instruments of revenge against relatives attempting to steal her estate, remains the sequence most frequently cited by the small audience who encountered the film as the moment The Uncanny's premise achieved genuine menace, despite its inherent absurdity. The Uncanny received almost no North American theatrical distribution, entering the market primarily through late-night television syndication packages years after its original European release. Denny Heroux continued producing internationally throughout his career. Peter Cushing discussed the production only occasionally in later interviews. The film has been released through Severin Films in a restoration that finally gave North American audiences proper access to a production most had never had the opportunity to see theatrically. The Uncanny convinced horror legends to take household cats seriously as a threat. Blood and Lace convinced almost nobody of anything, disappearing so thoroughly after its brief 1971 release that even genre historians spent decades treating it as a footnote rather than the genuinely disturbing production its content actually delivered. Blood and Lace, 1971. A teenage girl witnesses her mother's murder and is subsequently placed in an orphanage run by a sadistic administrator whose disciplinary methods, combined with a series of new deaths connected to the facility, suggest the original murder and the orphanage's current horrors share a connection nobody investigating either crime has been willing to fully pursue. Philip S. Gilbert made Blood and Lace for American International Pictures, with Gloria Grahame playing the orphanage administrator, her Academy Award-winning pedigree bringing unexpected dramatic weight to material that AIP's marketing treated as straightforward exploitation horror. The orphanage setting, filmed using an actual institutional location whose genuine bleak atmosphere required minimal production design enhancement, gave the film's disciplinary cruelty sequences a documentary starkness that distinguished Blood and Lace from more stylized Gothic horror of the period. Gilbert staged the murder sequences with a directness that several regional censorship boards found excessive for the film's PG-adjacent marketing classification, creating distribution friction that limited the film's theatrical reach beyond its already modest initial release. The meat locker sequence, in which the original murder's true circumstances become gradually clear through evidence the protagonist discovers within the orphanage itself, was the content most consistently cited by the extremely limited critical attention Blood and Lace received upon release, as evidence the production was considerably more formally accomplished than AIP's exploitation marketing suggested. Blood and Lace has been released through Shout Factory in a restoration. Philip S. Gilbert made no further theatrical horror features. Gloria Grahame continued working in film and television until her death in 1981. The specific orphanage location used throughout production has not been definitively identified by film historians, studying the production's minimal surviving documentation. Blood and Lace disappeared despite genuine dramatic credibility in its cast. The house on Skull Mountain disappeared for entirely different reasons, an inheritance mystery combining voodoo mythology with Gothic horror conventions that never found the specific audience its genuinely ambitious premise deserved. The House on Skull Mountain, 1974. 4 distant relatives are summoned to a remote southern estate for the reading of their grandmother's will, only to discover the property harbors genuine voodoo mythology connected to their family's specific history, and that someone or something connected to that history has decided the inheritance should never actually be distributed among the assembled heirs. Ron Honthaner made The House on Skull Mountain for Chocolate Chip Productions and Pinto Productions, with a cast led by Victor French. The production notable for its predominantly black cast at a period when the horror genre rarely centered stories this explicitly around black family history and voodoo mythology, treated with genuine cultural specificity rather than exploitative shorthand. The Southern Gothic estate setting, filmed using an actual historic property whose genuine period architecture gave the production a visual authenticity no soundstage construction could replicate, provided Honthaner's camera with atmospheric value that partially compensated for the modest overall production budget. The voodoo mythology woven throughout the narrative, treated with more genuine research and cultural respect than the era's typical exploitation approach to the subject, gave the film a specific thoughtfulness that critics examining it decades later have increasingly highlighted as distinguishing it from more careless contemporary treatments of similar material. The ritual sequence in the film's third act, in which the family's actual connection to the estate's voodoo history becomes fully explicit, was the sequence most consistently discussed by the limited audience who encountered the film through regional theatrical distribution and subsequent television broadcast, as evidence of genuine ambition beneath the production's modest resources. The film, The House on Skull Mountain, was released in theaters by 20th Century Fox. Ron Honthaner made limited further theatrical features. Victor French went on to significant television work, including Little House on the Prairie. The Southern estate location used throughout production has been identified by regional film historians. Silent Scream, 1979. A group of college students rent rooms in a large Victorian boarding house near their campus, unaware that the house's elderly owner is concealing a family secret in the attic above them. And as the semester progresses, the tenants begin dying one by one in a mystery that connects directly to whatever the owner has spent decades trying to keep hidden from the outside world. Denny Harris independently produced the film Silent Scream, with a cast that included Barbara Steele returning to horror after a lengthy absence from the genre, her casting bringing genuine gothic horror pedigree to a production that also featured Yvonne De Carlo and Cameron Mitchell in supporting roles, an ensemble considerably more accomplished than the film's ultimately modest commercial reception reflected. The Victorian boarding house setting, filmed using an actual period property whose genuine architectural details gave the production visual sophistication beyond its actual budget, provided the mystery structure with a physically credible environment for its secrets to remain concealed within. The film's slow-burn approach to revealing the attic mystery, prioritizing sustained dread over frequent violence, distinguished it from the more explicitly graphic slasher content that was becoming increasingly commercially dominant by 1979, a tonal choice that may have contributed to its limited theatrical impact against louder competition. The attic revelation sequence, in which the full scope of the family secret finally becomes explicit after the film's sustained build-up, was the sequence most consistently cited by the small audience who discovered Silent Scream through television broadcast and subsequent home video, as evidence the production's patient pacing paid off, despite its commercial underperformance. Silent Scream has been released through Scorpion Releasing and Kino Lorber in a restoration. Denny Harris made no further theatrical horror features. Barbara Steele's appearance marked one of her final significant genre roles before largely retiring from acting. The Victorian property used throughout filming has been identified by location historians studying the production. Silent Scream assembled genuine horror royalty for a mystery nobody noticed. Scream Bloody Murder abandoned any pretense of ensemble prestige entirely, tracking a single killer's psychological deterioration from childhood trauma through adulthood with a directness the era's more polished productions rarely attempted. Scream Bloody Murder, 1973. A young boy accidentally causes his father's death in a farming accident and loses his own hand in the same incident, and the film tracks his subsequent institutionalization and eventual release into adulthood, where his childhood trauma and prosthetic hook hand become the specific instruments through which his accumulated psychological damage finally expresses itself through violence against everyone he encounters. Mark B. Ray made Scream Bloody Murder independently with a production budget that the finished film's minimal locations and small cast reflect as having been assembled through considerable resourcefulness rather than any conventional studio infrastructure. Fred Holbert plays the adult version of the traumatized protagonist, with a physicality built around the character's prosthetic hook hand, the specific weapon becoming both the literal murder instrument and a constant visual reminder of the childhood accident that originated his psychological deterioration. The film's structure, spending considerable time establishing the protagonist's childhood trauma before advancing to his adult violence, gave Scream Bloody Murder a psychological through-line that distinguished it from more straightforwardly violent contemporaries that typically minimized character background in favor of faster pacing toward the kills. The farmhouse flashback sequence, in which the original childhood accident is depicted with a sustained formal seriousness that treats the trauma as genuinely tragic rather than simply narrative setup, was the content most consistently discussed by the extremely limited audience who encountered the film through regional distribution. As evidence, Ray was attempting genuine psychological horror beneath the production's minimal budget constraints. Scream Bloody Murder has been released through Code Red in a restoration. Mark B. Ray made no further significant theatrical features beyond the 1976 release of Sisters of Death. Fred Holbert did not continue an extensive acting career. The specific farming locations used throughout production have been identified by film historians as being located in and around Little Rock, Arkansas. Scream Bloody Murder tracked a single killer's psychological collapse across decades. Sisters of Death moved into more conventional slasher mystery territory, an underground production that eventually saw a high-profile restoration by Vinegar Syndrome, having remained so genuinely obscure for years that even dedicated horror collectors spent years uncertain whether surviving high-quality prints existed anywhere outside a single distributor's now inaccessible archive. Sisters of Death, 1977. A sorority initiation ritual involving Russian roulette results in a member's accidental death, and years later the surviving sorority sisters are lured back together at a remote estate under false pretenses. Discovering too late that someone connected to the original tragedy has spent the intervening years planning a specific, methodical revenge against everyone who participated. Joseph Mazuka made Sisters of Death independently with a production history so poorly documented that film historians researching the production decades later found conflicting information about even basic details like the actual shooting year. However, it is now widely accepted that the film was actually shot in 1972 under the working title The Second Coming of Eve, before sitting on a shelf for years and finally receiving a limited theatrical release in 1977. The remote estate setting, filmed at the Piazzoni Ranch in Monterey County, California, provided Mazuka with atmospheric value that compensated for the extremely limited overall production resources. The Russian roulette opening sequence, staged with a directness that several critics have subsequently argued was more genuinely disturbing than the film's later, more conventional slasher sequences, established a tone of genuine menace the rest of the production only partially sustained. The revenge revelation sequence, in which the specific identity and motivation connecting the killer to the original sorority tragedy becomes explicit, was the content most discussed by the extremely small collector community that eventually tracked down surviving prints of Sisters of Death decades after its virtually non-existent original theatrical distribution. Sisters of Death has been released through Vinegar Syndrome in a restoration reconstructed from surviving print materials. Joseph Mazuka's subsequent career has not been extensively documented, as he did not direct another theatrical feature. The film's production timeline, specifically its 5-year delay between filming and distribution, remains a subject of ongoing interest among film historians studying the era's independent regional horror circuit. Devil Times 5, 1974. A transport vehicle carrying 5 disturbed children to a psychiatric facility crashes in a remote snowy area, and the children, now unsupervised, make their way to a nearby lodge where a group of adults are gathered for a weekend retreat, unaware that their young guests harbor violent psychological conditions the adults have no framework for recognizing until the specific danger becomes impossible to ignore. Sean McGregor and David Sheldon co-directed Devil Times 5 with a production approach that used its remote lodge setting, filmed at an actual isolated mountain property, to create genuine physical isolation for the escalating violence between the disturbed children and the adults who initially welcome them without suspicion. The child performers, cast in roles requiring them to portray genuinely disturbing psychological conditions and eventual violence, gave the production a specific unsettling quality that distinguished it from more conventional adult perpetrator horror. The young cast's committed performances generating discomfort, several contemporary reviewers found difficult to fully process given the subject matter's inherent sensitivity. The large setting's genuine winter isolation, filmed during an actual seasonal shoot that gave the production authentic snow-covered exteriors, no studio construction could replicate on comparable budget, provided MacGregor and Sheldon's camera with atmospheric value throughout the film's escalating tension. The large confrontation sequence in the film's third act, in which the adults finally understand the full scope of what they invited into their remote retreat, was the content most consistently discussed by the limited audience who encountered Devil Times 5 through regional theatrical distribution and subsequent home video, as the moment the production's genuinely unsettling premise reached its complete expression. Devil Times 5 has been released through Vinegar Syndrome in a restoration. Sean McGregor and David Sheldon made limited further films together. The Mountain Lodge location used throughout production has been identified by regional film historians. The film has developed a small but genuinely dedicated cult, following specifically drawn to its unusual premise, combining child performers with sustained horror content. 7 films, real stars, real studios, real distribution deals, and every single one disappeared anyway. Sometimes so completely that even dedicated collectors spent decades uncertain whether surviving prints still existed. None of it mattered to how thoroughly these productions vanished. Which of these 7 are you tracking down first? Leave it in the comments. Subscribe if you want this archive to keep finding what everyone else forgot.